A quintessential part of any Trials Review Day program is having a look at how varieties are performing across the Wimmera and Mallee. So with that in mind, we're going to have a look at how cereals have been performing in the last season. And to do that, I'm going to welcome Rob Wheeler to the stage. Rob Wheeler's recently joined GRDC as the Southern Region NVT Manager, and he's based in Adelaide. Prior to this, Rob was the Principal Scientist and leader of the SARDI New Variety Agronomy Science Program based at the Waite Precinct. And Rob has extensive experience in cereal agronomy research, including NVT management, herbicide tolerance and plant nutrition, and has a strong involvement in communication and extension. You can follow along in your manuals. There is an NVT cereal variety summary on page 35. Welcome, Rob, to the stage.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, just while you're looking at that manual for those variety results, I will pay a particular tribute to Kelly Angel for putting that article together. I think she did a brilliant job of summarising how things went last year and in the longer term. So just to kick off in this talk, as my title suggests, I'm the NVT manager for the Southern Region, so responsible for overseeing all the NVT trials across the region, and as you would expect, this presentation this morning is really going to focus around the NVT trial results for wheat and barley. I'm sure that you all know or have heard about the National Variety Trialling System. It's regarded as one of the best coordinated, largest coordinated variety trialling systems in the world. It's certainly envied by other countries, and there are some other countries that are actually trying to copy it at the moment. And you'd all be aware that it's all accessible, the data's accessible from nvtonline.com.au, and I'll have a video later on in the presentation just to show a bit of this. In Victoria, there's something like 110 trials across the state covering 9 different crop species, and nationally there's over 650 trials conducted annually, so it's a huge, huge program. There's something like 13,500 trials in the system that have spanned 14 years so far. So, yeah, in starting to talk about wheat and barley in the Wimmera and Mallee last year in the longer term and how things are going, I just thought coming from Adelaide, I thought I'd better brush up on how things went over here, and I had a look at your weather map, and it's not much different to what our weather map was for last year. It was a shocking year, really, one of the probably the worst ones I've seen for many, many years. And just in summary, I don't want to harp on it too much because I'm sure you're all trying to forget what happened last year in terms of the weather, but you know, it was a very late and variable opening, caused some problems with getting seed in the ground and established nicely and so on. It was cold and dry all through winter and all through spring. But one of the big things that did happen was a lot of frost, and that certainly had an impact on the NVT trialling system that I'll talk further about. So frosts were really prominent. I think the only positive I can see from it all was that there was really low disease pressure, so we didn't have to worry about the rusts and so on in trials. But overall, it really significantly impacted the NVT trial system, the weather conditions. Now turning to the cereals, wheat and barley, and I'll start with wheat. On the screen, you'll see that in the Mallee, 4 trials were successful. Results were released. In the Wimmera, it was 2. I've got on the screen there what the average yields were. I think if I can work this thing. Oops. Well, I'm not sure whether I like this thing. I'll avoid that, I reckon. Anyway, the average yields in the Mallee were just over 1 tonne, and in the Wimmera just over 2 tonne. And I think did John, you say 10% of your usual yields? Great. So you'd be going for 10 tonne usually, would you? Not a bad effort. Anyway, yeah, as you can see, the yields in the trials strongly reflected what you guys were getting on farm. Probably the pleasing thing was the grain quality results there, and you can see screenings were relatively low. Test weights were quite good throughout the average of all the trials, and the proteins were quite reasonable as well. So that's just a bit of a snapshot of the quality. It was successful in that a number of trials were harvested and gave us useful results, but I will I will make mention of the fact that we also had a lot of frosted trials and heavily droughted trials that were very variable. And in those sorts of situations, we had 10 of them across the wheat NVT trials that were either frosted or heavily droughted. And in those sorts of trials, you don't really get good head-to-head comparisons of varieties for various reasons. And what we've done in recent years is put the results of those compromised trials into a quarantine trial report. And I just want to mention on the right-hand side of your screen there that that's the front page of a quarantine trial report, which you can get online. If you go onto the NVT online website, you'll find the quarantine trial report, and it details the results from those trials that weren't officially released, but they were either frosted or they were droughted or shattering happened or something happened to cause the results to be dubious. So just make mention of that, because a lot of people ask us about what happens with frosted trials and so on. The other thing that I will mention is that the last couple of years we've tried to introduce early break trials into the NVT trialling system. So I'm very aware that growers are wanting to put cereals into the ground in April. NVT trials normally, main season NVT trials normally don't get sown until about the first week of May or late April. So the last couple of years we've been trying to put early break trials in that mid-April period. Now, it hasn't really worked. It didn't work last year for us. There was just no trials able to be sown in that period because it just there was no rain. Right through South Australia and Victoria, we didn't get any of those early break trials in, but they will be. We're going to continue to do that work into the future, and we're also looking at possibly watering them up to try and get some trials in the ground and get some results from early sown wheat. So the seeding date range last year was really 9th of May through to the 8th of June, which is, as you can see, probably a little bit later than usual, but that was when the rains came and the trials still went into the ground in a timely manner. We're now turning to the yield results from last year, and this is wheat I've got on the screen here for the Mallee and Wimmera. Again, these results you'll see in Kelly's report, so if you really want to see the detail. But a main thing to emphasise there is that I've highlighted in green the varieties that have just been released in the last 12 to 18 months. There's been about 4 varieties that would suit the southern region, released from either AGT or Longreach or Intergrain in the last 18 months. I'll try and use this thing. I don't like this much. Vixen. Okay, Vixen performed really well last year. You can see that in the Wimmera and the Mallee, it was one of the top varieties. Vixen is an AH variety that Intergrain released late last year. I'll talk about its disease resistance and so on shortly, but it's certainly it's derived from maize, and so it does have high yield potential. And as you'll see, it's done really well. It did really well in Victoria and South Australia. So that's one to take note of. Just a little bit below that is Razor. Razor was pretty hopeless, that really. Razor was released by AGT early last year as an IMI-tolerant variety with a maize background, so it's a really high yielding. In fact, it's the highest yielding of the IMI-tolerant varieties, certainly something you should be looking at. And Razor did quite well. You can see that both in the Wimmera and in the Mallee, it is amongst the higher yielding varieties, and especially when you compare it with other IMI-tolerant varieties. Just a little bit below that, you'll see Sheriff highlighted there. Sheriff is another IMI-tolerant variety that was released by Intergrain late last year, and this variety is much later than all the other IMI-tolerant varieties. It's more like the Trojan maturity, so it's towards the Yitpi sort of Trojan maturity, which is a lot later than other IMI-tolerant varieties. It performed really well last year, considering you wouldn't have expected that sort of maturity to do well in a tight season like last year. And so you'll see Sheriff there mentioned, which has done reasonably well. And on the far right hand side of the Mallee chart there, you'll see Longreach Long-Reach Havoc, which was released about 18 months ago as that's again another mace type with shorter straw than mace. And it didn't have as good a year last year. You can see it's at the tail end, and it wasn't even in the top group in the Wimmera trials. So that one perhaps didn't perform quite so well. But I just want to mention there's a number of new varieties that have been released in the last 12 to 18 months, and a lot of them are doing reasonably well. These varieties on both of those charts are ordered by their longer term performance. So you might wonder why they're up and down, why I haven't listed them in ascending or descending order. It's because they're actually listed. The left-hand side of both those charts is the highest yielding variety. So I'll now turn to the longer term results, which again are in your books, except that here we're looking at the 2014 to 2018 long-term results. And now they are ordered, or they are ordered in descending order. So on the left-hand side of both charts is the highest yielding varieties. And you'll see that over the longer term, which is really what we want to put the emphasis on when we're looking at choice of varieties, you can see in the longer term that Vixen, Scepter, Beckham, Trojan, Razor, Sheriff all feature amongst the longer term performances, and they're the ones that you really want to take more notice of. You can see Yippee is well off the pace now. It's sort of down the right hand side of both of those yield charts. So Yitpee's well off the pace. Even Scout is reasonably well down, and Cord, I heard Cord mentioned earlier on, has been a great IMI-tolerant wheat up to now, but I think we've certainly got much better IMI-tolerant wheats available to us now. One of the things I did want to emphasise is that you can see, particularly in the Wimmera, the yield results from 2018, which are in the blue bars, compared to the yield results in the long term in the red bars, and a lot of difference in performance between 2018 and the longer term. So just goes to show that you really do need to look at long-term performance when you're looking for choice of variety. A quick snapshot of disease resistances, because yield is one thing, disease resistance and quality are the other very important factors. And some of these new wheats that I've just mentioned, Vixen and Havoc, you probably took note of Vixen having high yield, but it does, its disease resistance might be challenging for you. As you can see, it's a lot better for stripe rust resistance than Scepter, which is MS to S, as you'll see on the screen. These disease resistance categories, I should mention too, are also from the South Australian Disease Guide that Hugh Allwork releases. I couldn't get hold of Grant Holloway's latest figures for disease ratings, but they're not going to be very different to these, I wouldn't imagine. But I just wanted to put these up to show that there are differences in disease resistances with these newer varieties that really do need to be considered. So one of the things that you might be concerned about is both of those Havoc and Vixen that I mentioned before don't have as good a CCM resistance as what Scepter has got, and some of the other varieties you might be growing. So that's just part of the package you do need to look at. The IMI-tolerant wheats, I think there's a lot of interest in this area, because we've had Grenade and Cord up to now. There's a lot of Cord around. It's much an older variety now, and as you saw, the yield results are starting to be outclassed well and truly. But if you have a look at this range of IMI-tolerant wheats that we've now got available to us, on the left-hand side of the screen is the names of those varieties from Razor, Grenade, Chief, Cord, Sheriff. They're all in descending order of maturity. So Razor is the earliest one, and Sheriff is the latest one in terms of maturity. So a very big range in maturities. Razor would be several days earlier than Mace, at least. It's probably more like Korak type maturity. So we've got a good range in maturities there. Sheriff really well suited to being later. It's well suited to late April, early May sowing, and that's really going to suit a lot of people that are probably currently growing Trojan for that reason. Again, with the disease resistances, they do vary considerably for disease resistance, each one. I've highlighted some of the VS and S type categories that you do need to be careful of. And I think it's just on the right hand side of the screen, they do vary also for quality. Cord and Grenade are certainly the best quality with AH, but most of these newer ones are actually only APW quality or even ASW for the highest yielding one in razor. So that does need to be part of the equation as well if you're looking to move to those options. Just now turning to grain quality, another aspect that needs to be considered, and I always like to look at things like screenings and test weight because we have come unstuck with some varieties in the past with these things. And on this screen is a list of the average screenings for 24 main season wheat trials conducted across Victoria for the last 2 years. So I've got 2 years worth of data there, all averaged, all comparing where every one of those varieties was in the same trial. So we're comparing apples with apples. And you can see on the right-hand side of the screens that Shield, Cosmic, Cord, these are varieties that do tend to have higher levels of screenings across a lot of trials. And I've seen this many, many times in the past. It's repeated in South Australia. So, you know, they're ones that you do need to be aware of. They might throw higher level screenings in certain situations. But you'll notice also that a couple of the newer varieties, Vixen is on the right hand side of that screen. Razor is up there a little bit, so they're a little bit higher for screenings than what you'll certainly see with the likes of down this end of the screen. We've got things like Trojan and Korak, Yitpi in the middle. So screenings need to be considered. Test weight, another thing you'll see on the right hand side of the screens, the varieties that have always been great for test weight, things like Scout and Korak and Mace and Estock, always been quite good. Down the left hand side of the screen, Gladius, we've always had problems with Gladius and Cord with lower test weights, but you also see Vixen, unfortunately, is down there at this bottom end of the screen. It could be a little bit lower for test weight too on farm. So just wanting to bring that to your attention. This is a slide which I put together. We often get asked how do varieties compare for their grain protein. We're seeing lower and lower proteins often in the newer varieties, and the usual response is that is a dilution of the yield effect. Often as yield goes up, protein will come down because there's only a certain amount of nitrogen in the soil, so it makes sense that as yield goes up, your proteins will tend to go down. And this graph here is shows again it's 24 trials for the last 2 years in Victoria, all head-to-head comparisons of a heap of varieties. And you'll see that, oops, yeah, I've done it. You'll see that we've got that typical negative relationship between yield and quality. Geez, I'm struggling with this thing. Got that typical negative relationship between yield and quality. Sceptre, right down the bottom end of the screen at really high yields, 3.9 tonne average there, but it's certainly one of the lowest protein varieties. And then at the top end of the screen on the left-hand side, you'll see Yitpi. Not a high yielder, but the proteins are right up. So you've got that typical relationship of yield to protein. The spread there along that line is about 0.5 to 0.75%. So within any one particular level of yield, you can get about 0.5 to 0.75% difference in varieties for protein. And a good example of that is looking at, say, Scout and Estock in the middle of the screen. Scout and Estock about the same average yield, but there is at least 0.5% difference in protein. The Estock is higher protein than Scout on average. I think the only thing I really additional thing I wanted to say here was that it's quite interesting to see two varieties that actually stand out a little bit, and that's Razor down here, where is it there? Razor and Estock up here. You'll notice that they actually deviate from that relationship quite a lot, and it's quite interesting that Razor and Mace got the same sort of yield, but there's almost 0.75 to 1% difference in protein between them. So I think that's quite interesting. I haven't got an explanation for it, and certainly something that we need to look into a bit further there. Again, S-Doc's the same. It's that a lot higher protein than Scout, given that they're both about the same yield level. A turn quickly to barley now. Same sort of summary here. The barley's yielded a lot better than the wheats last year. You can see 2.2 tonne average across 5 sites in the Mallee, and 3.85 tonne average for the 3 sites in the Wimmera. Again, grain quality was really good across those barley sites. We didn't see, as you would expect, barley's more tolerant of frost than wheat, so we didn't see as many frosted barley sites as we did with wheat. In the end, we only lost Ultima and Colbinabin, and that wasn't frosted. That was just a variable site. Only lost 2 sites. The seed date range was pretty much similar to the wheat, so 5th of May through to the end of May for seeding dates for those trials. Similar sorts of graphs that I presented for the wheat. You can see that last year the varieties like Fathom and Compass performed really well, and not unexpected. I'm not sure how many of you grow Fathom. It's a Weight Institute barley that was released a number of years ago, but it was released because of its increased tolerance to low moisture and low nutrient stresses, or high nutrient stresses. So they tried to develop a barley that would really perform under really stressful conditions, and I think you'll agree that 2018 was quite stressful, and Fathom performed really well. Compass also performed well in the Mallee last year, as did Latrobe, and a new variety, Buff, which is interesting. You see in the middle of the screen there, Buff is an acid-tolerant variety which was released by Intergrain last year. It's only a feed variety at this point. It's still going through classifications, but Buff, as an acid-tolerant variety, really performed well, and even performed well in those Wimmera trial results, as you'll see in the bottom graph. There was no new varieties released in barley last year, and so I'm not going to say too much about what we already know. Probably we're trying to consolidate the information we've got on Planet. Planet's obviously raised a lot of eyebrows, and it really needed a tough year like last year just to see how it would perform, given it's done well in better years in previous years. So we're consolidating our thoughts on where Planet fits. You might all be aware that Planet is currently undergoing malting accreditation, and this is it's entering its last phase of that, and I think March this year we will know whether Planet is going to be suitable as a malting variety or not. So there's a lot of people waiting on that information. But last year you can see that across the board, Rosalind, Fathom, Compass, Buff, Latrobe were really the better performers, and Rosalind has been a standout performer now. I'll turn now to the long-term results. And once again, the 2 graphs are ordered, so left-hand side of both graphs are the highest yielding varieties, down through to the lowest yielding varieties, and Gardner on the right-hand side of each one has been the lowest yielding variety over the longer term. So you can see that Rosalind and Planet really have been up amongst the top yielding varieties over the longer term throughout the Wimmera and Mallee over the last 5 years. There isn't a lot of difference really between the top 6 varieties in the Mallee. There you can see there's not that much difference there, and even in the Wimmera, the top 4 or 5 at least are very similar yielding. So, but at the end of the day, you can certainly see that Scope is now outclassed by Spartacus. Spartacus and Latrobe and Highmarsh didn't have a great year last year. I'm not sure whether you saw that on farm. You'll see by these results, certainly in the Wimmera there, that in the middle of the graph in the Wimmera there, Spartacus, Latrobe, Highmarsh were some of the lower yielding varieties in those 3 trials in the Wimmera. Again, emphasising in these graphs that last year was quite different to the longer term, and we really need to look at long-term results when choosing varieties. Okay. yeah, another way of emphasising this is a screenshot that you can get from the NVT online website, and it just goes to show. In this instance, we're looking at the Mallee results for the last 5 years, and you'll see that the results for 5 varieties there. I can't even find the thing here. On the right-hand side, you see that the yield results for 5 varieties in 2018 is much different. The spread on them is much different. The order of those varieties is much different to what it was back in 2016, the wet year. And you can imagine that, or you can see that making a decision based on 2018 results is quite different to what you would decide in 2016. So really need to look at the long-term performance. Another way of looking at this is to look at the varieties ordered by their yield potential. And in this graph, again, another one that you can get from the NVT online website, it shows the ranking of varieties as yields increase from half a tonne on the left-hand side of the graph right up to 6 tonnes on the right-hand side. And around that 3 tonne area, they're all pretty similar in their performance up to about 3.5 tonne, but then once you get above that, that's when they spread out, and that's when Planet tends to take off. As you can see, it's the one in orange at the top of the 6 tonne area there. Planet and Rosalind in green, and then you've got your Spartacuses and Compasses and so on that don't tend to do so well at that higher yield level. Very quickly look at test weights. Nothing much new there. Over the years we've seen Fathom and a lot of the weight barleys like Commander and so on tend to have lower test weights, as you'll see on the left-hand side of that graph. On the right-hand side of the graph, you'll see Spartacus, Latrobe, Hindmarsh always have pretty good test weights relative to the other varieties. But I want to really emphasise that Planet really is looking to have an issue with test weights, and you can see it is one of the ones that does have a lower test weight on average. Oops. And in terms of screenings, on the right-hand side of the varieties that tend to have higher screenings, and this is 34 sites over 2 years. Gardner always has high screenings compared to the other varieties, but Planet is also up there as well. So Planet does have a few issues with test weight and screenings that you need to be aware of. Right. Just acknowledge where data sources, all this information I've presented is available from the NVT website, NVT online. The data analyses, long-term analyses, all prepared by the SAGI National Group, and I also acknowledge Hugh Woolwork for providing me with an upfront copy of the latest disease ratings, and also locally to the BCG and Eurofins groups who undertake all the NVT trials in this area of Victoria, Wimmera and Mallee, and all the collaborating farmers that they work with for doing those trials. I just want to conclude with a short video that you should take home some information on how to interpret.
In this video, I'm going to talk about accessing and interpreting the long-term yield results on the NVT website. Long-term yield results are the most robust and reliable means for making variety selection decisions using NVT data. You can access the long-term Met Reporter directly from the website. Today I'm going to select Birchip in 2018. Hit the go arrow and it will zoom in to that region selected. I'm going to select the main season wheat trial. The first and foremost is the long-term yield results. Here you'll find the tabulated Met data from 5 years at Birchip presented as a percentage of site mean yield. Varieties are ranked and sorted by an overall performance average, and each prediction is colour-coded with blue and green indicating high yields and yellow and red indicating low. The meta-analysis produces a prediction for every variety in every trial, regardless of whether or not it was actually grown there. You can turn the Present in Trials button off to complete the matrix and see all the non-present predictions for this data set. This might be useful if you're a grower looking for information on a variety that has not been grown at your area. There are menu options at the top of the screen where you can filter the varieties or the grain classification. Here I'll pick Australian hard, and the dataset's limited to only those varieties with AH classification. In the top right corner, you can turn the chart type to a line graph to better interpret the performance of varieties. This grabs the 6 highest yielding varieties based on their overall performance at Birchip. The predicted yields are charted based on the variation from the mean in tonnes per hectare. You can also add multiple locations to the dataset with 2 options for viewing the results. Here I'm going to add Hopeton. The data presented now shows averages across the 5 years for the Birchip and Hopeton data combined. Alternatively, the second option is to turn on the Load Individual Data button in the advanced options and view the individual trial results on the chart screen. This will be useful for growers that want to get an overall indication of performance of varieties at a number of environments around their farm. Trials in the dataset with low accuracy and low variance accounted for are automatically excluded from the default dataset. Using the slide bars, you can open up the data values to reintroduce all trials into the dataset. You can also change the report type toggle from year to yield group to present the data based on half-tonne yield groupings. This is a good way for users to see which varieties perform well in high-yielding environments compared to those that perform well in low-yielding environments. Using the tabs across the top of the screen, users can also view information on grain quality and the single-site yield predictions. As you can see, there's an immense amount of information available through the NVT reporting systems. In this video, we've only just scratched the surface, so I encourage you to jump online and have a look for yourself. The site runs across all browsers, including mobile devices, but is best viewed on larger PC screens.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rob. We've got time for a couple of quick questions. Straight over the back. Oh, sorry, Rob.
Rob, how you going? Simon Craig. Just a question on the NVT, and probably more of a comment from an advisor point of view. We always have the trials like wheat going onto a set rotation, and we keep presenting the data as a mean of all the sites. So if we keep presenting as a mean, then why do we need so many sites? And wouldn't there be the value of having different stubble rotations or time of sowing management practices going into these trials that help us as advisors or farmers know where the best varieties fit? Because Scepter probably goes more on wheat for a lot of my clients, and those other varieties that don't have yellow leaf spot resistance tend to go first. So when we're sitting down with the client and we're reviewing varieties, quite often that'll be the conversation that Scepter didn't yield as well. We have to make the assumption that's because of the stubble rotation. So I certainly see a lot of value. The barley agronomy initiative that we were involved with, that was exceptional for doing that, and there's probably also a question for Rowan and Courtney whether GRDC will expand the NVT to actually have more purpose than just identifying the top varieties. Thanks,
Simon. I knew you'd ask a question like that. Look, the NVT trials aren't, it's not regimented. It's not part of the protocol that they have to go wheat on wheat or any set rotation. They've got to follow district practice when it comes to rotation, and certainly I can't speak so much for the Victorian trials, and I might hand back to Claire perhaps to answer this, but in South Australia we do try and ensure that the trials are on a range of different crop types. So in the Pinaroo trial, for instance, is wheat on wheat in the Mallee of South Australia, but the other Mallee trials aren't wheat on wheat. They might be other different rotations. So we do try and put them on different rotations so that you do avoid that one situation like you're talking about. Maybe Claire could add something to that, but are they all wheat on wheat?
Well, I generally try and avoid wheat on wheat, because then you've got, if you don't have a good summer rain, you've got volunteer wheat coming up in next year's wheat trial, and that could potentially be inflating, a bit more in some plots than others. So for that reason, we avoid wheat on wheat. But yeah, if you get this year, we've had a fairly good summer rain, so you could probably go a cereal on cereal, and knowing that everything's already germinated.
But yeah, it is generally good practice within these NVT trials to spread practices around a bit, so rotation shouldn't be all the same with all the trials, and even the herbicide options. It's nice to not use the same herbicide option on every trial. We found that many years ago, that if you just use the same herbicide option, you could be actually biasing the results just based on herbicide tolerance.
It's just I'm concerned when we have all these new varieties come out, they're supported by NVT, but they suddenly experience something in season. Compass is a classic, that came out, Flagship before that, Scope with its itchiness. I just think that we don't want to find growers adopting new varieties because it's easy, but then throwing it out soon after. I think that's a backward step for the industry, and we really need to take these variety trials further into identifying these things before they get adopted. That's probably where I'm heading.
Time for one more question.
Your early sowing varieties, the ones you want to sow in April or March, they're including winter wheats, are they?
They are including winter wheats. There's a lot of different ranges in response times of winter wheats. There's fast maturing winter wheats like Cutlass and Longsword, and then there's the longer maturing winter wheats like Kitty Hawk and Wedgetail. So it does include those, but it's typically targeting varieties that should be suited to April sowing as opposed to May sowing. So you wouldn't put Scepter or whatever in those trials. Even Trojan is a little bit short for those types of sowing. So yeah, we are targeting the right maturity groups for those trials.
Good, thank you.
Just before I wind up, NVT Online, can I have a show of hands how many people have been on NVT Online and use it? And just on that, I mean, the reason why I put the video up, we've just produced 3 YouTube videos featuring the NVT trialling system and what the NVT website can do. So you saw on the screen just what information is in there. It's just incredible what you can get out of it if you just have a bit of a play. But for those guys who don't like apps and things, it might not be too good.
Can I ask you all to please join your hands together and say thank you to Rob?